Hello, everyone. Welcome again to the Startup Societies Foundation podcast. Today, we are joined by Mwiya, who is a founder of the Nkwashi real estate development in Zambia. It's a big new city project, huge in scope, and I think it's obviously something we should talk about in the Startup Societies Foundation. So thank you, Mwiya, for joining us on the call.
It's a pleasure.
Absolutely. So one thing that we like to do at the Startup Societies Foundation is just sort of the background of the individual founders, what sort of motivates them to do these sort of projects. So what's your background? What motivates you to build such a monumental project?
So my background has got nothing to do with city development, actually. Prior to this, I was an analyst at a fund management company, and I did that for a couple of years. And before I was doing that, I worked at a tech startup in London, again, for about a year and a half. And prior to that, I was in college doing my master's degree and my undergraduate degrees before that. So what happened is, in coming back to Zambia, I knew I wanted to do something entrepreneurial, didn't know exactly what at the time. And so as I was working at this fund management company as an analyst, I got the chance to ask people a lot of questions about what drove Zambia's real estate market, what the needs were, where the gaps were. And it happened that my family owned a ranch that we weren't fully utilizing. And so I started asking myself questions regarding the potential use cases for the land other than agricultural use. And so as part of that journey, it became apparent that the biggest need was for housing initially, but much more generally, education as well, and the need to create jobs. And so we started working on a plan to create a high density settlement that would allow people to basically have work, but also have recreational facilities and amenities, as well as affordable housing.
So this certainly isn't a traditional investment. With real estate, it's pretty straightforward. How do you explain to co-founders or investors and partners what exactly you are doing and what sort of the business model is?
So I think the best place to start is always explaining the demographics, right? So Zambia right now has a population of about 18 million people. About a third of that live in the capital. And between now and 2100, that population is going to be about 100 million people in 2100, right? So the growth trajectory is pretty one directional. And as a consequence of that, we feel that the exponent on that growth as relates to land values would be much higher, right? So land values will appreciate much faster than actual growth because the demand as densification takes place will just outstrip that because you're going to be dealing with natural population growth as well as urbanization and rising incomes, all of which then creates this higher impact on land values. And so, at a first principles basis, that seems like a pretty interesting opportunity there. So the question is, how does one get exposure to that land appreciation? And a lot of this appreciation, again, will be happening in cities. And so it makes sense to either buy in cities. Challenge with that, though, is that to buy property in a city right now, any city, will always be much more expensive than the rural areas that bound that city. And so to our minds, it made sense then to create a new city and create our own anchor for value appreciation so that we could actually then ride the curve, so to speak. So that's what we start.
Excellent. And so a big motivation behind this project is middle income housing, trying to make it available to the population. But a problem with Zambia is there isn't a tremendous amount of mortgages. Did you have to make partnerships with different banking institutions in order to introduce more mortgages into Zambia in order to make this a viable project?
So yes and no. Sort of from a first principle basis, it helps to have as many people as possible involved in the project. So we have been speaking to building societies, which are basically home loan lenders, and we have 2 that we're working with. But to your point, there aren't a lot of mortgages, and the amount of financial depth in the system is pretty shallow. And so even with that, it wouldn't really have significant impact. And part of the reason is that at the very sovereign level, interest rates are just generally too high. And that's the case in most developing countries. Interest rates are too high, and therefore they price most people out. So even if you have banks and other type of lenders involved, it's still going to be problematic enabling people to have access to those financial products just from an affordability perspective. And so what we did is, as a first step, we took the credit risk, right? So we were offering land to people who want to buy subdivisions in our town and selling the land to them on payment plans of 5 to 20 years, and therefore creating a sort of financial system that enabled access. And because we're riding the appreciation wave, the IRR to us, because we bought the land pretty cheap, is still really attractive. And so offering the land on payment plans just makes sense to us. But
yeah, it seems that, I was just saying, like, your payment plans, you don't even require them to have a deposit. You simply say you just do a payment plan and you pay as you go. It seems that you have a lot of trust that things will foreclosures and there will be profits that'll be coming from people buying homes and mortgaging homes. That's very exciting.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we do is that we cover the position. So if a buyer defaults, they have to forfeit the plot and whatever principal they've paid, because we can't take liquidity risk and take credit risk and development risk. We have to sort of like ring fence ourselves from excessive exposure to risk. So that's unfortunate. If there was a way around that, we'd obviously prefer that, but we can't do anything about it at this stage.
Excellent. Well, it seems like there's a lot of opportunity in residential real estate. I know that you've mentioned in other articles that you think that commercial real estate or retail real estate is oversaturated in the Zambian market. But when it comes to new city projects, a commercial center, as you mentioned on your website, is absolutely vital. How do you plan to attract businesses to your development in order to have this effect where you can bring more and more people progressively to your development?
So the way we intend to do that is an anchor tenant, right? So ideally, that would be a large business that would have a relatively large pool of employees or customers who have to be based within the town itself. And so in our case, that's the university that we intend to build. The benefits of the university is that it brings a large population of students there, as well as a large population of people who service the students, be it grocery stores or restaurants, bars, and so on and so forth, as well as lecturers and other staff that work directly for the university. So that's step one. Step two then is enabling broad-based employment to be created within the town itself. And so the idea we've been playing with, and we're taking this pretty seriously, is applications like Uber, for example, have taken elements of jobs that cities used to perform in the past, which was making markets. So in the past, the city would regulate, it still does, who can be a cab driver. And to the extent that you get your medallion, you can now participate in that market. So that's a market the city created. What Uber's done is disintermediated that by creating a parallel market. The same thing with Airbnb. And one could argue that even the likes of Yelp, for example, are taking aspects of these responsibilities that in the past used to be taken on by civil authorities, either through a yellow book or some other means. And so our intention is, with that in mind, we intend to create an Andela-like platform. So Andela is this Africa-focused business that basically places software developers who are based in Africa into remote working jobs with global businesses, largely in the US. And so create a platform like that, where students who attend the university that we set up can be placed into jobs more or less immediately after they graduate with companies that are global in their orientation, right? And so they'll be earning hopefully hard currency, and then they'll be based in the city, so they don't have to leave the city. But because the university will keep churning out these graduates, and these graduates will always need jobs, what you start to do is populate your city with people who are actually working, and they have to live there, they have to work there, they have to spend there, and you start to actually create a marketplace that the rest of the city can benefit from.
Excellent. It's absolutely crucial to have institutions like universities that draw in talent and bring talent. Another element with a lot of these new city projects is they want to have a policy environment, a business environment that's more attractive than the surrounding areas. Does your development plan to add some sort of special zone framework or some sort of streamlined regulatory code to make it more attractive to businesses?
So we're working with the Center for Innovative Governance Research, which is run by Mark Lutter, to do so. So they're engaging the government in Zambia about introducing charter city policies there, which would basically take the existing special economic zone policies that the country already has and iterate them or improve them. So that's something that we think is necessary, something that we intend to work on achieving. But in our minds, that shouldn't be what ultimately makes the project successful or not. On a first principles basis, we feel that providing core infrastructure services and opportunities for employment and education, and orienting all of this to global markets will on its own create a pathway for success for ourselves and our residents. And what the governance framework does then is make that much more sustainable and incentivize businesses from outside the country to domicile into this city eventually.
Of course, the charter city or the special economic zone is merely gas on the fire. What you're providing is something that's pretty standard, but at the same time, really needed, and really, you can do a forecast that this can, lead to increasing land values. So that's awesome. What you're doing is largely an infrastructure and real estate play. Can you sort of say what type of infrastructure that you'll be providing to the development and why that will be attractive for the development versus the outlying areas?
Sure. So we're providing core infrastructure like roads, wastewater, water, electricity, public spaces like parks, civil spaces like halls. We're also providing public goods like security. In addition to that, on a for-profit basis, things like schools and the university.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're providing pretty much everything that a municipal government does, except for, and that's an interesting question, are you classified as a municipal government or are you just a property development? Because it seems that, road maintenance, security, fire safety, those are usually the purview of the local or municipal government.
Yeah. So we're basically doing all the key roles or functions that a city government would be fulfilling, but without being one. So we are a real estate developer. We're just a master services provider in this particular instance.
Okay, interesting. And there is some sort of check on Phoebes Capital, which is the company that's developing it, your company. And I kind of wanted to know what exactly the process is, because it sounds very interesting. The property is divided up into 12 different districts, and each of them votes on sort of a representative, and those representatives then vote on a board. Can you tell me sort of what the structure of this, and is it basically just a homeowners association, or do they have some sort of authority over the maintenance of this infrastructure?
So effectively, a strong homeowners association. What we're trying to do is achieve some sort of balance between providing democratic participation in the governance framework for the city by enabling actual residents to have a say in the affairs of the town, but at the same time balancing out for what we know is our best interest, as well as the actor with the most long-term risk exposure, because we're not going to be selling our positions in the city. So this is something we intend to hold indefinitely, and therefore our interests also have to be taken into consideration. And so therefore what we've done is provided for a board, or which would effectively be a board of governors for the city, that has representatives from the town, from businesses that are resident in the town as well, and ourselves.
Very interesting. This actually sounds very familiar to a town I used to live in, Celebration, Florida. It was a development by Disney, and they had something very similar to a very strong homeowners association that had a lot more say. But obviously, Disney still had a tremendous presence on the board, and they had like a certain amount that they controlled of the board. Did you look to developments like Disney or elsewhere for inspirations for your project?
Not really. We actually did look at the Irvine company quite a lot because we felt that has been a very successful story. Outside of Walt Disney World, we weren't very well informed as to how Disney actually manages the communities that support its theme parks and other such settlements that are under their supervision. So we didn't really read up on them quite a bit. We also looked at the Grosvenor Group, which is this 300-year-old business in London that owns significant parts of Mayfair, and tried to understand what they've done there to ensure that over 3 centuries that area has managed to remain a really sought after place to live. So yeah, I think the long-term nature of what we're doing has basically forced us to consider these more older projects.
Yeah, no, there's plenty of examples. I mean, it seems like you're following a lot of best practices, especially when it comes to the urban philosophy. It sounds like a form of neo-urbanism, mixed use, highly dense, strong commercial center. So what is your urban planning philosophy with this project? What are you trying to get out of it, depending on the structure of the city and all of its services?
So, I mean, to be very honest, we weren't very, very philosophical about our approach. We had some pretty real constraints. So the town itself is built on the edge of a plateau.
Okay.
And so the water aquifers are pretty deep and aren't extremely well charged, right? So we've had to build dams to supply the water the city will actually use. So we've built our first dam. We've got a smaller one that we use for construction purposes, and then there'll be a larger one that we're going to be building soon as well. And so because of that, there's an absolute number of people we can actually host in the town. And if we were to expand that, we'd have to buy more land around the town itself and build more dams. And so with that binding constraint, everything about the development has had to be designed in a way that takes this into consideration. So balancing 2 things. A, you want as many people in the town as possible because that's what raises land values, and that's what ultimately brings business there, not necessarily large anchor tenants, but smaller businesses to support the ecosystem. But on the flip side, there's an absolute there's a cap, right, on the number of people you can host. And so we basically went with that. So we just told our urban designers to be guided by those realities. And then the other thing is, because it's on the edge of a plateau, there's a lot of undulations within the estate. So there's a lot of hills. And so that also guides the total number of subdivisions you can do, what type of buildings you can put where. So we've allowed the geology and the hydrology to guide us.
Well, honestly, that's true with any piece of work, real estate development, art. Basically, creativity comes from the limits of what you can do. So it's very interesting to see that kind of influenced your urban design. Is there any practical examples of the type of infrastructure, the type of houses that you built that reflect that sort of constraint that you have based on the geology of the property?
Not so much the design. The buildings is just the placement of usable areas relative to green spaces. So a lot of the places that are way too steep for houses to be built in an affordable manner, we tended to have those allocated to green spaces. So hiking trails and such like. As far as the actual aesthetics that we've chosen for the city are concerned, it's an eclectic mix of contemporary designs. So some modern, so with a lot of straight lines, for example, extensive use of glass. We've also got Mediterranean styles in there because it goes really well with the undulations of the estate. We also have some prairie design styles in there, largely because that's what people like in Zambia right now. And so it also, in our in our minds looks like it's got a lot of staying power. So it wasn't extremely philosophically driven. It was much more pragmatic in its in the approach.
Of course. I mean, like if you get too philosophical, you won't actually make any decisions. It's important to act and then sort of have your philosophy articulated by your actions. I like that approach a lot. So in terms of the timeline of your project and the development of your project, where is it at currently?
We've been developing this for about 4 years now. And during that time, we've built one large dam. We've built about 25 Ks, that's kilometers of roads. We're paving all of that this year. We're starting to put up electricity infrastructure this year as well for all the zones that have been sold out, as well as water and sewage infrastructure this year. We've sold about 20% of the total stock of subdivisions within the town.
Nice.
So we have some ways to go. We expect that as these start to get developed and our first couple of homeowners are starting to build this year, that the velocity of sales will start to rise a lot more. And so our expectation is that within the next about 7 years, the primary market for the homes would have been completely subscribed for, and that thereafter it'll be a secondary market, so people selling to other people.
Awesome. That was another thing that I noticed on your website. Property owners, they get total, complete control over their property, whether it is to sell it or to have an inheritance agreements and everything like that. And that's because of the development has a direct relationship with the titling service of Zambia. Can you sort of say how effective has the titling service been in Zambia? And has it been streamlined? Has there been any obstacles?
So Zambia basically uses the British registry system in the sense that it just took what was used in the UK and had adopted that for itself. It's just a bureaucratic process, so it takes a little bit longer than it should. But other than that, it's very straightforward. Person buys land from you, you assign the land to them. They take that to the registry, and then a change in title is done.
Excellent. And one other thing that you mentioned on your website is that you are exploring different payment methods. Can you sort of explain what that potentially means? Does it potentially mean cryptocurrencies, or am I just thinking too much into the words?
Oh, I see. Well, there's a lot I was thinking about. So at face value, those payment modes initially. So a lot of people typically prefer to pay cash. We've been slowly directing most of our residents to use online payments. So we built a payment portal for them. And so they just log in and they can check their account status with us, how much they owe, and they can make the payments on a recurring basis through automatic deductions. So that was the first step. Longer term, what we want to do is effectively create a payment system that enables all transactions within the town to be hosted by ourselves. And that's because we've got these longer term plans to effectively have the entire town on blockchain. And so that will be a first step. Getting everybody to use a payment system for transactions within the town is step one. And then step two would be, having everything managed on a blockchain.
Well, that's very exciting. Are you simply in the research and phase of that whole thing, or are you further along in development?
So it's really mostly research at this stage. It's easy to execute the payment system because, strictly speaking, what we have right now could work as a peer-to-peer payment system within the town. It would just take another 6 months to a year to get there. But for blockchain, I think that requires a lot more thoughtfulness. And so what we've been doing is having a lot of conversations with people about how to proceed.
Of course, especially right now after there is this huge hoopla and big bubble, it's good to have sort of deflated and realistic expectations of how to use crypto in the future.
The thing that seems pretty clear to us is that if we execute, it won't be a true crypto. It would be a stable coin. It'd have to be tethered to the US dollar or a basket of currencies, but certainly not be full on crypto.
Would you think, in terms of stable coins, there is a basket of goods. Would you ever, and there is, tying it to a fiat currency, have you thought about the idea of tying it to the real estate value of your land itself, or would that be too unstable or a little bit too experimental for purposes of your project?
That's a good question. Initially, we considered that possibility, but we're pretty traditional in our understanding of macroeconomic and monetary economics, and so the way we think about currencies is pretty pragmatic. It's just something you need to enable transactions to be facilitated in a stable manner within a spatial area, right? And so the underlying philosophy is neither here nor there. What ultimately matters is whether people can actually reasonably trade in that currency. Like, can you buy a loaf of bread in it today and the price will be the same tomorrow? And 6 months down the line, the price will more or less again be the same. So is it inflation stable, right? If you get a loan, will the currency be stable enough that your interest rates will remain stable, right? And so if you have a lot of volatility in the currency's worth relative to other currencies, you're going to be importing inflation or deflation, and that's going to be reflected in your interest rates, which you really don't want for a town. And so the way we see it, ultimately, you need to have a currency that is reflective of your spatial area's balance of payments situation, right? And so what currency do you typically engage the rest of the world in? Use that, right? So if it's going to be the US dollar, then just tether it to the US dollar. And it worked for Singapore, it worked for Hong Kong. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. That's just our view.
Exactly. When it comes to money and finances, it's better to have innovation at the edges rather than tipping the whole table over and over again.
Exactly. So, to your point, I think what blockchain does that in our minds, it facilitates a lot more granular tracking of customer behavior, A, by the individuals themselves so they can better manage their own affairs, and then B, by businesses who they individual elects to allow to track them should they so desire. And that hopefully should allow for a much more convenient lifestyle. It's basically the equivalent of having Amazon everywhere, right? You don't need to have a full-on crypto for that. You just need the blockchain.
So it seems that a philosophy of your firm is to be continually pragmatic, but at the same time, you are embarking on an incredibly ambitious project. And before we conclude, I would like to know what your ambitions are for the rest of Zambia, the rest of the sub-Saharan, and possibly for all of Africa itself. Do you see your project as a minimally viable product or a first step in a series of iterations that will be placed everywhere else? Or is the ambition strictly towards this project right now?
We see this as the beta project, right? So it's the start. And so we want to use this as a basis for learning, document everything we do to understand what the different impacts were. Some of the things we've tried haven't worked. Some of the things we've tried have worked really well for us. And so we want to use those best practices to make this a highly repeatable model. And some of the things we've learned along the way are that there's a definite separation between the governance element and the development element of this and the actual investment element, right? And so what I mean is you don't have to be involved in every single layer of the stack, right? There are people who might want to own land and see that land appreciation. There are people who want to do so, but don't necessarily have the skills to administer a new jurisdiction. They don't have the competencies to develop that new institution. And so what we want to do is use all the best practices we learn from, rather we gain from building this first project to make this a very scalable model that's also relatively capital light, in the sense that we could take the model anywhere in the world, not just in Africa, but anywhere where the need exists, and replicate it and hopefully have investors tag alongside ourselves and gain exposure to the asset classes that they like, So if someone has a particular liking for energy, they'll have exposure to the electricity grid that a town would need. If someone has a specific interest in water and sanitation, they can have exposure to that. If someone wants direct exposure only to the land, they can limit their risk only to that. And so what we do is we take the market making role and expand it.
Last question. What are ways that the Startup Society's community can help your project thrive and be an example for the rest of Africa and the world?
Great question. I think one of the things that has been very surprising to me is just how much interest there actually is in new jurisdictions in places like the US. I didn't really expect it 3 years ago, starting this new development of ours. And, the way I've come to meet new people has largely been through interactions like these. And so I think one of the ways that the Startup Society could assist us, basically facilitating for new meetings with people, interacting with people who are interested in the space, and that could be anyone. It doesn't have to be any specific type of person, because our view is that we can learn from any single person who has genuine interest in the space. And so, yeah, we would definitely love to meet people, talk with people. To the extent that there are other people who are in your orbit who are doing similar projects or things, we'd like to meet them as well and hopefully learn from them, and perhaps they could also learn from us.
You heard that, everyone. That's a call to action. Make sure to visit the Nkwashi website at nkwasi.com. Read up about the opportunity. Contact them if you think you have any they can provide, and let's have 1,000 of these beautiful, wonderful new city projects thrive all around the world. Thank you so much for joining the show. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you for having me.